There we go. Okay, let's jump right in, shall we? We have a couple of really good Mishnayot with us on for today. And you'll see what I mean when we get to them. They're not only interesting in and of themselves, but I'm going to use them as examples of certain ideas that pop up over and over and over again in many different contexts, and start to define, what are the Mishnaic rabbis really doing? What are they doing on an ongoing basis intellectually? What are their go-to standard needs, questions, inquiries, right? How do they approach a problem, in other words? And so we're going to see a couple of examples of that today and start to become more familiar with their svara, their thinking, not just their words, but what's the mechanics. I do quickly want to just go over a couple of things because it does help to exercise the mind in this way, and for us to remember the larger picture of the Mishnah before we jump into the particulars of our Mishnayot today. And just to refresh our nomenclature, our jargon, the whole thing is the Mishnah. Within the Mishnah, there are 6 shisha sidarim, 6. You have to put on your Passover hat. Who knows 6? Shisha miodea. Who knows 6? Shisha ani. Now you can say ani odea. I know, right? Shisha sidrei Mishnah. Everybody say it. Shisha sidrei Mishnah. The 6 seders of the Mishnah. And if you remember, I gave you a mnemonic device for the first Hebrew letter of each of the 6. Zman, Zayin Memnun, Nakat. Zman, Nakat. If you ever forget, what's the orders? You just need to remember those things. Zman, Zraim, Moed, Nashim, Nizikin, Kodashim, and Taharot. Zraim deals with all of the agricultural laws and also blessings, brachot. Moed means set appointed times, meaning times of the year, and it refers to the holidays. So Shabbat, Pesach, Yom Kippur, Sukkah, Rosh Hashanah, all the fasts, Purim, etc. Nashim, women, deals with the laws of levirate marriage, the laws of ketubah, the laws for vows. The reason vows is there is because the Torah is explicit that daughters' vows can be overturned by their fathers, and wives' vows can be overturned by their husbands. So there's a whole category of vows that deals specifically with women's vows and how they could be ordered. Most of that is really intellectual play around ideas, who did what for whose personal vows, we don't know. Also the sotah, the suspected adulteress, divorce laws, and marriage laws. Nizikin, what you and I would call civil law, torts, damages, contracts, testimonies, things like that, including corporal punishments. Kodashim and Taharot, the last 2 seders, deal with matters of the temple. The things of the temple and its offerings, so all of the animal sacrifices, and also all of the instruments and measurements of, and the holy vessels and holiness. So all the laws of purity and impurity, which had particular relevance to the priests in their service in the temple. Any question on any of that? No? Good. Okay.
I just noticed that I just noticed that menstruating women wasn't in women. It was in the temple ritual purities.
Right. It's unique amongst Taharot. Okay, so it could go in the other one, right? It's not that it wouldn't make sense to be in Nashim, but it also makes sense to be in Taharot. So it's an editorial choice, I think, on the part of Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. And if I were to speculate on their reasoning, it's because it affects men specifically, because contact with a menstruating woman disqualifies you for service in the temple. So priests, right? It affects priests in their service in the temple.
Earlier, when we started all this, you said that 4 and 5 weren't really applicable today.
Right.
But I assume, like every other Jewish thing, there are exceptions.
There are exceptions, and Nida is the exception. There's full Talmud on Nida, but there is no Talmud on all the rest of Kodashim and Taharot. Just Mishnah. But Nida has, like, because the temple was not around, so there's no practical application of all the rest of the Kodashim and Taharot. Like, it's nice, interesting discussion, but you don't have to put the incredible effort into editing a Talmud out of it. And very often, Mishnayot in those Seders are referenced in other arguments Talmudically. But in Kalim, it says something contradictory. In other words, the Mishnayot there are of equal legal value in an argument. You can raise a Mishnah from there as an objection to something that has another context. But there's no practical application to the laws themselves, so detailed analysis and deliberation is less important. Except Nida. Yeah. Okay. Now, let's jump into today's topics. Come on. There. Oh. Okay. I don't want to close. I don't want to close. Okay, you can see that?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Okay. Today we're going to start in Bava Batra. Bava Batra. Oh, you know what? I'm going to go back here to this other one. Sorry for the jumping around, just so we can again locate ourselves. Oh, wait a minute. That's not what I meant to do. Did I close that other one? All right, never mind. Bava Batra is in Nizikin. All of the Bavas, Bava Kama, Bava Batra, and Bava Metzia. Above means a gate, a gateway. It means the first gateway, the middle gateway, and the last gateway. And they are all really part of a larger meta masechet, which is divided by subcategory. And it's really all of the civil and monetary and legal and contract cases, things like that. So we're going to look here today at a, sort of property rights and property responsibilities case. And I want us to remember that the rabbis are interested in measurements. That's one of their overarching ideas. What's the measure? How much does it take to make something that thing? At what point does something become full? How much do you have to eat to be considered eating? How much wine is required for kiddush? And putting actual shiurim, measures on things is very important to them. Okay, so we have a whole series of instructions about property. One does not dig a pit near the pit of his neighbor, nor a ditch, nor a cave, nor an irrigation stream, nor a laundry pool. So all of these things are similar, right? They're all ditches, holes in the ground that we dig for different purposes, unless he has distanced it from his neighbor's wall by at least 3 tefachim, as well as plastering it. Okay, there's a lot in there, right? So first of all, what's a tefach? A tefach is a hand breadth, the breadth of your hand. It's roughly 4 inches. So 3 tefachim is just about a foot. It's not very far. It's what we would call a minimum. There is a minimum distance that you can come close to your neighbor's wall. There's a wall between you and your neighbor, or to one of your neighbor's structures on their property, a pit that they have dug on their property, unless you are at least a foot away from them. Why? By the way, you also have to seal the pit that you dig. Those two, that's related to the why. You ever dig a big hole at the beach, big sand hole at the beach? Right? What happens when the hole gets too big? There's water in the hole, and it eats away at the sides, and the sides collapse. What happens if I dig a pit right next to my neighbor's wall?
All can collapse.
Well, right, I'm going to jeopardize the integrity of the structure of his wall. Why isn't this why do I need them to say this? This is kind of obvious, right? I call this the "I'm not touching you" Mishnah, right? Where your brother, right, puts his finger right against your nose like this, and he's like, "I'm not touching you, I'm not touching you." Right? We all know you're still touching me, right? You cannot come right up next to me. There is more than a millimeter required. So what's the minimum? Just as I can't say to my brother, "Hey, stay at least 6 feet away from me at all times," or I'm going to say, "You're touching me." Oh, come on, that's ridiculous too. So we have to figure out, and of course, I'm digging this pit on my property. I'm not digging it on his property. I'm on my property. I can dig a hole anywhere I want, right? I mean, it's my property. Well, no, is the answer. No, you cannot. Yes, it's your property. But as your property comes up against somebody else's, you start to have, impact on them. Right? Your right to swing your arm ends where my face begins. Right? You can't just swing your arm. I was just swinging my arm. No, you can't make that claim. I wasn't trying to undermine your wall. You can't say that. And it's not a very big minimum, but there is a distance that you have to go, because it's anticipatable. You should know that. And those kinds of thinkings, they're in our law too, right? A reasonable person should know that when you dig a pit right next to a wall, you jeopardize the integrity of the wall. That should be common knowledge. You could know that. That's not engineering. So you have a responsibility not to do that, and they're categorizing that in the law, and they're giving it a shiur, a measure. Now, questions about any of that? There's a few more examples. Yeah, Mickey?
This is talking about person to person, not government to person. Is that correct?
That is correct. This is two people's private property. This is not public. Right? There are cases where we deal with our running up against public property, where, right, like what's inside my store versus what's just outside my store. But this is not that. This is between neighbors.
Are you gonna
In
separate?
fact, in fact, Mickey, if you go to the Hebrew here, lo yachpor adam, a person should not dig a hole samuch leboro shel chavero, his fellow man, right? Meaning his neighbor. Yes, Barbara.
I was gonna ask if you're gonna discuss separately the manure and the urine.
Yeah, we're going to get to those next.
Okay.
So now we know the minimum distance. Now there's more about how we have to be with our neighbors. One should distance organic refuse like mulch, compost, right? Rotting stuff, manure, piles of manure. People kept manure then as they do now. Salt, plaster, and rocks from his neighbor's wall by at least 3 tfachim, as well as plastering. What's these things? What's the difference here?
Contamination.
Right, it's not so much physical infringement, undermining the physical structure. It's all of these things are corrosive. They don't really stay in one place. They leach. They affect the distance around them at least somewhat. And in some measure, you know, some of them, they smell, right? But rocks, like imagine a big giant pile of rocks, right? You have to picture like this is a farm or something, and they've cleared rocks and they're like piling them right next to your wall. Like that could easily, shift and destroy my wall. So you have to anticipate those things. And if you put them in a pit, you have to plaster that pit. Even though salt isn't like water, right? It won't physically, mechanically undermine what's next to it, but it will leach, and then everything around it becomes salty. So if I plant, if I dig a big salt pit right next to your property, that saltiness is going to leach into your property when it rains, etc. And the same is true for organic refuse and manure. And these are all things that you don't really want them right next to your property. I will say it's a pretty minimum distance. They could have said, 6 feet. But they're establishing a relatively lenient minimum. Yeah, Barbara.
How did a homeowner obtain water in this day? Is it a community source, or is it I have my own well? What?
It's a really good question. There's definitely irrigation and well digging then. People dug wells, private wells, as well as having public places. If we're assuming they're living in the northern part of the Galilee, they're fed by streams and by the Dan Springs and river and the Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee, and they would have had irrigation ditches. That's an irrigation stream. So they would have fed off of a larger stream or a well or a spring, and either through ditches irrigated or through aqueducts. There's some aqueduct, there's some movement of water, public works kind of things. And they would have gathered water, they would have collected it, roof gathering, big cistern.
The reason I ask is because years ago in hydrology class, we were taught 30 feet minimum separation between your septic tank and your well.
Right.
And hopefully your well was the one uphill and your septic tank downhill. But
Right, yes.
so as you say, this is very optimistic.
Very optimistic, right. In fact, I would say it shows that they are being theoretical rather than applying their learned experience from farming. But that's just my opinion. Yeah, Margaret.
Are we talking about people who are living on farms? And if so, what would be the size? Or are we talking about people who are living in towns, or this is both?
I think it's a little bit of both. I don't think it's specific here. Some of these things are things you might have even in a small piece of property. They all do seem like you have to not be living in a townhouse, right? I mean, you don't have, property like this is, you would have enough to dig and plaster a pit that you would have full time. That's I don't know, even in like those 0 lot houses, you wouldn't have that. But people also we're talking about your neighbor's wall. So, how long and big a wall can you build? I don't think these are farms like Oklahoma kind of farms, but I think they are small family holdings kind of thing. At least that's what I'm imagining. Welcome to those who are coming in. So that's another example of like how if we were actually in a classroom instead of online and somebody new walked in, everybody would turn and say, "Hi, Marcia. Hi, Royals. Great to see you. Come on in," right? And it would just be so easy and natural. You just walk in, pull up a chair, and right, yeah, that's good.
I'm sorry to be late. I'm still having repairman here for my flood, so I'm sorry. He just left.
I'm sorry about that. I love you, and I'm glad you're here. Okay. The last piece here, no, not quite the last piece. The next piece is one should distance one's seeds, plow, and urine from his neighbor's wall. Here too, they're sort of covering all their bases. You see how they like to make lists. They like measures and they like lists. Lists help delineate things that are too big to delineate. And so while this doesn't cover every possibility, it covers a lot of it.
Is the lesson just to pay attention to that your actions affect other people? Because we're saying how the measures really are minuscule. Right. I mean, is it just that to know that whatever you do on your land, you are responsible for how that impacts your neighbor? And correct. So it's just a lesson on being a good neighbor.
Right. I don't think, by the way, this going 12 inches necessarily shields you from culpability. You could do something stupid 14 inches away instead of 12, and you can't say, "But I was the minimum." right? So this doesn't entirely shield you, but it is an initial prevention. And I think you're right, Cindy. It establishes the idea that you do not have unlimited property rights on your own property, especially in the areas that immediately impact your neighbor's property. And the next two examples are really just examples that are mechanical things, a millstone and an oven, which in those days, they would have had like a permanent outdoor oven. And you might not have had cooking in your house. If you wanted an oven for bread or something, to like really cook something in an oven, not just over a fire, you would have had like, an old style pizza domed thing that was outside. That you have to distance from your neighbor and from your neighbor's oven, and the millstone also. Distance the millstone 3 tfachim from the base, which is 4 tfachim from the upper stone. That just has to do with so that the stone doesn't tilt over while you're operating the millstone. You don't have unlimited privilege on your own property. And at the same time, though, I think they're trying to strike a balance between property rights and what the limits are. It does seem like they are, since it's kind of a small distance, this is I would describe this, I hope I'm not being, I hope I'm being apolitical here. This is pro-property rights, even though it restricts them. It is recognizing that you have the right to do all of these things on your property. And we're going to limit it, but we're going to limit it relatively minimally. We're going to recognize that, people's property is their property. You want to dig a hole on your property, dig a hole. So long as you know that, like you said, you are responsible for what your property causes as damage to your neighbor's property. And you do have some basic minimum obligations simply by owning the property. Those default upon you. But it does recognize that it is yours. And so you can dig a ditch, make an irrigation, pile up poop, big giant pile of rocks, like you can run your own, run your own backyard. So long as, hang on, I'm going to pause the recording for 1 second. Okay, thank you everybody for pausing on the recording. If you're watching this later, you should just know I shared a nice, funny personal story of my own homeowner bureaucracy. Okay, any other questions on this mission? And on the basic idea that it's trying to get across? Yeah, Marcia.
We probably talked about this at the very first meeting, but I either have forgotten or I didn't hear it. When do you use the Mishnah? Because a lot of this sounds, I don't know what word it is, Narishkeit.
Well, I think what you mean is not less Narishkeit, because I do sympathize, right? Sometimes I have the same feeling, so I'm not beyond that. But I was also trained towards respect and regard for the authors of the Mishnah, right? They're not just some Johnny-come-latelys, right? I was told, don't even say those guys. Like, no, say the rabbis, right? Like, don't just lump them together with everybody who ever was. That's not to say they're not beyond reproach, but I think what you mean is self-evident. These things are self-evident. Do I really need them to tell me this stuff? Like, can't I figure out that I shouldn't damage my neighbor's fence? And I guess the answer to some extent is yes, but to some extent there's a basic idea in the Mishnah is trying to concretize the Torah's laws and instructions, the mitzvot in the Torah. This is derived from, in theory, passages in the Bible that describe how you're supposed to be with your neighbor, which are pretty plentiful. And the basic idea is that the Bible doesn't give you mitzvot about things that nobody does. In other words, there's no mitzvah in the Bible, don't cut off your own foot. Because, people don't do that, right? I mean, like, it doesn't tell you to not do things that nobody does them, right? It occupies itself with things people actually do. And so if it's giving instruction about this, the idea is, we could argue whether it's true, but the idea is, these are, we have to analyze this stuff because these are things that happen. And, there are neighbors' disputes about your tree is hanging over and it's dropping nuts on my roof. And that gives me squirrels and I need you to cut down your tree. I'm not cutting down my tree, right? No way, that's my tree. It gives me nuts. Huh. Right, I mean, those, we would like them to be self-evident, but unfortunately people are stupid. And they don't know to keep their trees off their neighbor's property and vice versa, right? So sometimes you have to have these kinds of laws.
Keep thinking about the one about Shabbos, where if you
right.
cut a pear and some of the juice drops on the table, I just can't get over that.
No, I'm very sympathetic. I really am, Marcia. The argument in favor of it is they're obviously pushing the envelope. They're obviously exaggerating to the point of near, if not full on ridiculous, in order to really get at the edges of the issue. That's how you could describe it positively. The other is these guys are missing the big picture of life and they are lost in the tiny details.
Okay.
I think those are actually both valid, depending on the specifics. I think they are, yeah. I find, personally, I find examples of that, of both of those things within the Mishnah and the broader rabbinic literature. So yeah.
Well, maybe I can listen better now.
Right. Well, here's what I take away from it personally. Here's the spirituality of it for me is this is intellectual sparring. I'm growing intellectually. I really do see this as push the envelope, reach. It is the exploration of the idea. It's law school. It's not that this particular case will make you a better lawyer. This particular case will make you a lawyer. It will make you a person who can think about and analyze the minutia of the law. Understand it, integrate it into your svara, into the way you think, so that it becomes more natural. I see it very much like taekwondo sparring. You work on this tiny little minutia of how you refine individual motions, and so that you can integrate them into a fluid movement of, when you're actually thinking, now I have this thinking integrated into mine. So that is what I try to derive from it. Yeah. And the good thing about Mishnah study in this way is, if you think this one's Narishkeit, don't worry, we're going to start another one in just a minute. You could be right, but don't worry, we won't spend any more time on it than is necessary. Yeah, Margaret, did you have?
I was just thinking, we had a tree. Our neighbor had a tree that was impinging on our property.
Mhm.
So we were allowed to cut down the part of the tree that was impinging on our property.
Right.
But it would have been very nice to have had this rule, so we could have got 3 hand breaths, because of course the next year it was impinging on our property again.
Again, right. Yes.
You know, these kinds of rules are, yeah, I mean, there's a way in which they're silly and then a way in which they're useful.
I'll share with you I have 2 very similar stories that both happened very differently. One day, maybe 2 days after I bought this house, a registered letter came to me from one of my backyard neighbors telling me that one of the trees on our property, a ancient tree, a hundreds of year old tree, a beautiful, gorgeous, like one of the largest in the state kind of trees, saying that tree has to come down because it's threatening my house. And my daughter swings in our backyard, and you're gonna kill our daughter if you don't cut down your tree, basically. And said that registered mail to me so that, if something happened, I was, liable for it. Day after I bought the house. Okay. I did not take the tree down. I had a tree guy come out, trim the tree, look at it, evaluate it. He's like, that tree will live for at least another 20, 30 years. I'm like, okay. No problem. And it's a fantastic tree. I'm not cutting that down. No way. It doesn't impinge on her house at all. She's a busybody. And she didn't have the common decency and sense to walk over to me and say, hi, neighbor. Just wanted to let you know, welcome to the neighborhood. And I'm a little bit concerned about that tree. Can we talk about it sometime? And I would have been like a very friendly neighbor, because that's exactly what happened with one of my other neighbors. There's a tree back there. We had the tree guy come out to do something else, and we wanted those trees out, but they're sort of in between. They're in no man's land. So I walked over to the neighbor. I said, do you mind if my tree guy cuts those trees down? He's like, no, I don't like them either. I'm like, okay, great. I got it. He said, do you want me to share the cost? Oh, how about that? See, like, I think, we forget that if you just walked over to your neighbor's house and said, hey, neighbor, we share a boundary. How about we share the burden of taking down this thing that we both don't want? And you shake hands and you make nice. My other neighbor, he let me run my pipe underneath his backyard. I dug up his whole backyard. He just said, sure. So anyway, we made it right. We fixed it back up. We repaired whatever we didn't undo, and it's good. It's better for everybody. See, Marcia, now you got me on a little rant. I'm like, in some ways, this kind of legislation undermines that kind of common sense. In some ways, it protects you from a lousy neighbor. But in other ways, it establishes a way of dealing with each other that is essentially adversarial rather than communal. Yes, civilization and its discontents.
And we had another neighbor that with whom we could deal very well with another tree thing. So.
Right. Yeah. It's it really does depend on the people, doesn't it? I said to my son the other day, I don't remember what we were talking about, but I said 99.8% of my problems are because of other people. and it turns out it's only from about 1% of other people. Go figure. Okay, we go back to Mishnah Brachot, the very, very first. This is the first Mishnah in the Mishnah. And I mention that both because it's kind of cool. Like, this is the first Mishnah. And I hope that when we get to the end of the Aleph-Bet Mishnah, which we're working our way towards pretty quickly, that we will, in addition to that, study the very last Mishnah together, so that we will have studied the first and the last and 22 other ones in between. That'll be pretty cool. Okay. And I only want to point out here that there is no introduction to the Mishnah. There's not a preface where at the beginning of the book, the editors say, here's what we are doing, and here's what the book is and what we mean by it. That does not exist. So you will see that there is an assumption in the Mishnah that you already know it. Okay, that it will become clear what I mean in a second. Me'ematai korin et shema be'aravit. The basic question is, from what time, from when, meaning what is the earliest time when one may recite the Shema in the Ma'ariv, in the evening prayer service? If you recall, we say the Shema twice every day. The Torah says when you lie down and when you wake up. So we say the Shema at night as part of Ma'ariv, and we say the Shema in the morning as part of Shacharit. And even if you don't daven Ma'ariv or Shacharit, you are supposed to say the Shema. An individual person is supposed to have a daily recitation of the Shema. And here again, we see this is a question of measure. What's the beginning? When is the earliest? Is it 4 o'clock? Is it 6 o'clock? Is it 5 o'clock? Is it 6:15? Right? What's the earliest? And this is the answer. From the time when the Kohanim go in to eat their teruma, and then it gives an end time, a latest time also, until the end of the first watch, according to Rabbi Eliezer. Now, if you're like me, and you just opened this book, you must be thinking, what? But like, I don't understand any of that. What are the Kohanim? And what is the teruma? And how am I supposed to know when they go in to do it? I don't even know who they are. And what's the first watch? What are the watches? And when is the end of the first watch? Where are any of these terms defined? And the answer is none of them are defined here. That shows that there's an assumption that this book is intended for people who already know some of this stuff. This is not an introductory book for people who know nothing about Judaism. At least it wasn't written that way. It assumes you know about the Kohanim, the priests, and the elaborate rituals of when they can eat their priestly foods, the truma, and what the hours of operation are in the intricacies of the temple, the watches. Right? That's people who are in law school, not middle schoolers, right? Middle schoolers don't know jurisprudence. If I start in right away with high-level jurisprudence, you have to assume I'm talking to law school people, not to, school-age kids. So let's try to define some of these ideas, okay? There was a time the Kohanim would dip in the mikveh during the day, and they could only, even though they were already tahor from the dipping in the mikveh, it didn't really become official until nighttime. There's a whole Mishnah called Tevul Yom, those who immerse during the day but can't eat of the holier food, the tahor food given in the temple until it's evening time. And so that's what they mean. And for the end of the first watch, the evening was divided into a number of different watches, different rotations of serving priests. The temple was a 24-hour operation, so you had shifts, right? Until the end of the first evening shift, according to Rabbi Eliezer. And the Chachamim Omrim, the Chachamim say until midnight. Now, a couple questions. Without really knowing anything else, we can tell between Rabbi Eliezer and the sages Who gives a longer period of time to recite the Shema?
Sages.
The sages, correct. Whatever the time is, Rabbi Eliezer gives up until a certain amount of time, but the sages say, no, even longer, ad chatzot. And that's true. Now, I want to assign a certain number of specific times of day here, so we have a sense of what we're dealing with. But it's important to remember that in the time of the Mishnah, the day was not divided like the day is divided now. Hours did not mean the same thing. A sha'ah, an hour, was not necessarily always the same amount of time throughout the year. Here's what I mean by that. In the rabbinic mind of the Mishnah, daytime hours are divided into 12 sections, 12 sha'ot. And nighttime hours are divided into 12 sections, 12 even sections. So on the two equinoxes, midnight is 12, noon is 12, evening starts at 6, and morning starts at 6, right? That's sort of the ideal. 6 o'clock is the beginning of the day, noon is the middle of the day, 6 p.m. is the end of the day, meaning the beginning of the night, and 12 o'clock is the middle, and 6 o'clock is the morning. Okay, so those are the numbers we're going to use. Even though in wintertime, when daylight hours are shorter, an hour would be less time. So you would have less time to say the Shema. You would have more time to say the Shema in the winter time, because nighttime would start earlier and chatzot, midnight, would be later than you would in the summertime, where nighttime begins later and evening is shorter, so therefore midnight is earlier. Did all of that make any sense? I hope so, because it's super confusing unless you just operate as if it's always the equinox, which is what we do, right? We divide the day into 24 even hours all year long. An hour is an hour in December, and an hour is an hour in July. And that's so much better, right? I mean, I don't know why they didn't figure that out earlier, but this is better. And certainly easier universally, and it's how we're going to think about it, okay? All right, I'm going back to the screen here. So let's assume that the Kohanim go in to eat their truma at 6 o'clock, right? That's the beginning of the evening time. After all, we're talking about the Shema at Aravit. So we can say that's the beginning of Mariv time. And that's the earliest you can say the Shema. And you can go until 10 o'clock, according to Rabbi Eliezer. The Chachamim, however, say you can go until midnight. Now we have a third opinion. Rabban Gamliel says until the break of dawn. Meaning, on our calendar and our clock, 6 a.m. So Rabban Gamliel is the most lenient. Rabbi Eliezer is the strictest. You have to start they all start at the same time. They all answer the initial question the same, but they all give different parameters for the ending, when you have to have said it by. One says by 10 o'clock, one says midnight, and one says if it's night, it's night, it's night, you have until early the next day. Okay. Now the Mishnah is going to give us a ma'aseh, a ma'aseh. It's a story that is going to prove one of the positions that it's offered, right? They're not giving this to us just to tell us the story. This is a story of how somebody actually behaved, a sage actually behaved, and from it, we're supposed to deduce what the correct action is. So we have a ma'aseh. It once happened. that Rabban Gamliel's, remember Rabban Gamliel said 6 a.m. He's the most lenient. Sons came from a house of feasting, right? They were at a party. They're presumably a wedding. That's what the Gemara assumes. They came from a wedding. It was late in the night. And they said to him, we haven't said the Shema yet. After all, they were partying all night. They started early. The wedding went all night. They hadn't said the Shema. And he said to them, if dawn has not broken, you're still obligated to recite it. Right? So not only did he say 6 a.m., but we know that he gave his own offspring that particular advice when they asked him. And therefore, we can assume that that is the correct answer. And the Mishnah continues, this is not only true of this case, meaning the recitation of the Shema at night, but rather in all cases where the sages say until midnight, their mitzvot are in force until the break of dawn. And they give a couple of examples. Burning the fat on the sacrifices, their mitzvot can be performed until the break of dawn. And all sacrifices which may be eaten for one day, their mitzvot can also be performed until the break of dawn. So what are they doing here? They're radically expanding the leniencies. Anytime the sages say, do it by midnight, what they really mean is you have until 6 o'clock in the morning. That's a very big allowance, right? I mean, that's like extra half of the night. Presumably, we're doing this because we want to enable people to do the mitzvot. We want to give them more time to do it and not discourage them. After all, if you come to me at 12:30 and like, oh, I forgot to do this thing. And I say, sorry, your time's up, right? You're not going to do it. It's discouraging. So I want to encourage people to do the mitzvot. I want to allow as much time for them to do it within the kosher time at the right time. So yeah, you got the whole night, right? It said nighttime, it's nighttime. The question, however, becomes if that, and that makes sense, doesn't it? What I'm just saying, right? Look, we're spiritual teachers. We want people to do mitzvot. That's the premise. Make it easy on them. Okay, right? I mean, you shouldn't make it hard. It's hard already. The question then becomes, why say midnight? Why did the sages give an earlier time rather than just allowing people ab initio from the beginning to do it at 6 a.m.? I'll give you an example. Matzah. You're supposed to eat your first bite of matzah before midnight. But if you don't, you have all night until sunrise to eat matzah, and you fulfilled the mitzvah of eating it the night of Passover. That's a big mitzvah, to eat matzah on Leil Pesach. That's a core Jewish identifier for people. It's a touchstone. We got caught up at the beginning of the Seder. It was late. We started late and we were drinking and we didn't get to the matzah until 12:30. Don't worry. It's all good. But then why do the sages say, do it before midnight? And the answer is to distance a person from transgression. If I said to you, it's the deadline crisis. If I say to you that paper is due on March 1st, there's going to be a lot of people who don't start writing until February 29th. And what's going to happen when you come up against, right? You're going to be like, bleep, I missed it. And if you miss the train, you miss the train. Can't go back and eat matzah the night before. You missed that opportunity. You missed a major important thing. So it's not that Gamliel and the sages disagree. Rabbi Gamliel and the sages agree that you have all night to do the mitzvot, which are supposed to be done at night, are permissible all night. It's a broad leniency applied to night-based mitzvot. But don't wait until 5:59. In fact, best to do it by midnight before you go to bed, so that you don't have to, maybe miss the deadline. Now, when I teach this to kids, I give them the following, and I give them the following couple analogies. The first of which makes sense to adults too. I say, if there's a cliff that drops 100 feet, and there's no barrier or fence whatsoever, and it's kind of a little precarious right at the edge of the cliff, and you want to walk along that ravine, do you walk right on the edge of the cliff right there, just 2 inches inside the cliff? No, you do not. Why not? Because it's very easy to slip, right? People trip all the time, just walking down the street. Very easy. And if you do, the stakes are pretty high. You fall 100 feet down the cliff. Now, do you walk 2.5 inches in or 3 inches in? No, you don't do that. You walk 2 or 3 feet inside from the cliff, right? You give yourself a little berth, a little safety space. You don't walk right up next to something that you know is dangerous and that you could, fail at. That's foolish. Then I say, I like this one because it's like good for kids to hear their clergy talk about this stuff. I say, let's say there's a party and you know that they're going to be doing stuff at the party that you don't want to do. Right? What's the best way to not do it?
Don't go to the party.
Don't go to the party, right? Like that. This is right. It's obvious, right? I say, okay, but you want to go to the party, but you want to go. So you go to the party, and they're smoking and drinking in the back. So, okay, now you're at the party. What do you go and stand right by the back door? Like, oh, I'm not back, right? I'm just like, it's okay. I'm in this party. That's over there. I'm over here. No, if you want to be at the party and you don't want to do what they're doing in the back, stay out front. Right? I mean, like, it's, again, Marcia, you may say, like, isn't this self-evident? But it's not self-evident. People have a normalcy bias. They have a bias towards thinking what they're doing is normal and okay, and is not going to result in negative consequences. We'd be paralyzed if we didn't have that. But that means we have to establish a kind of routine where we distance ourselves from things that are either enticing or dangerous that we don't really want to do. Don't wait till the last minute to start your paper. You might finish it at the last minute. I get that, but don't start at the last minute because you're gonna be late. Don't go to the place that you think is dangerous because better to stay away. Don't walk right up to the edge of the cliff. And I think you do have to learn that in life. We've all sort of slipped probably half a dozen times and fallen down the cliff, so we know better. But like you have to learn that stuff, and I like applying it to our religious life because I think people can be especially fast and loose with those things. Like, yeah, well, I'm not sure if I'll make it to Minyan or not, as an example, right? Well, if you are like, waiting until the last minute to see whether you'll go that day, chances are you're not going to go. But if you establish a precedent and you set your alarm early and you make it part of a routine, again, it becomes part of your ongoing spiritual path. And you distance yourself from sin. Maybe we don't like to think this way, but sin croucheth at the door, right? It's easy. It's very easy to mess up and to go against what you yourself want for yourself. So the rabbis are trying to establish here a corrective, a practiced corrective to that. Don't wait till 6 o'clock in the morning to say the Shema. Say it by midnight. You don't have to be like Rabbi Eliezer. You can go to the party. Not everybody at that party is going to be in the back. You can go, but so you don't necessarily have to be like Rabbi Eliezer. But don't wait till 6 in the morning. Don't stand by the back door. Don't go alone. Right? Yeah. Yeah, Cindy.
But so I'm thinking about in terms of religious practice. And so it seems to me that in this Mishnah, the rabbis are allowing as much leniency as they can so that you can perform a mitzvah.
Right.
So I have this ongoing thing with my mother where she will only light Shabbos candles, at the right time.
Right.
Okay. And I, on the other hand, feel like, well, if I miss the mark one way or the other, better to light Shabbos candles than to not. So, in light, so like I want to say that, the rabbis would allow me that leniency so I could do the mitzvah, but would you argue with my mother, on my mother's side?
Well, I'm always going to take the mother's side, right? That's like, it's the same kind of strategy. I mean, why would you not? Like, that's like, distance yourself from, falling down the cliff. Like, always take the mom's side.
I know. If mom's happy, I'm happy. I know.
No, but it's an excellent point, Cindy. I mean, I'm so glad you said that because it shows the internal tension between letter and spirit.
Right.
Okay, so and let me say what I mean by that. Your case is, I know I should have done it earlier, but I said Mariv at 5:59, right? I did it. So if you want me to do the thing, then you got to allow me the time, and that aligns itself with the basic spirit of this Mishnah to say, look, we want people to do those things, and we know that people live varied ways, so not everybody can do it exactly at the same time, right? So we give a stretch of time. You allow flexibility within the law. The case to be made for your moms is this does not fall into the same category. You're taking from a different letter of the law. That's an issue of violating the Shabbat. It's asur to light fire on Shabbat. By permitting you to, even if they wanted to, see, there's not Hillel wagging his finger at you. Don't mistake that. Even if they wanted to say, come on, let Cindy have some space, right? She's doing a nice thing. That's true. I'm not arguing that. But they would be allowing you to violate a mitzvah. Right? The mitzvah is don't light fire on Shabbat. That's why you have to light it 18 minutes before. Right? You have to add a little bit of time before. That 18 minutes is a buffer. Yeah, you could light at exactly that time, but we don't do that. We light a handful of minutes before, 3 tvachim, right, of minutes earlier, so as not to boy, if you lit on the other side of that line, you've violated the principal prohibition of Shabbat. That's very bad in the rabbi's mind. That's a major no-no. So it's the tension between strict and lenient, between letter and spirit. I want to be lenient, but if I'm lenient here, I'm actually not serving the interest of the person who is living the law, right? Ultimately, law must serve people. Ultimately.
Yeah, mother's right.
Right. Yeah.
Again,
Well, I will say
And
this.
now you all know the shameful thing about me.
No. I'll say this. Here's my, I'm going to call it a more mature perspective because I want to feel good about it. So I'm going to call it that. Here's what I think is in what I've grown into as a perspective. You each have a need. There's a need underneath each of your behaviors. The need is actually very similar. And yet she has a need to hold that line. Holding that line is valuable. She would rather miss one than cross that line. And that tells me something. I know that feeling. It's a good feeling. I stand for this. I won't cross this line. I'd rather miss one than violate the sanctity of that experience and that trust that I built with myself. I was that way about driving in a car. For 30 years, I did not get in an automobile on Shabbat or Yom Tov once. And then I did. And it was super important to me to hold that line. I held it even to my great inconvenience for a while. But you also have something you need. My need changed. You need the flexibility to light when you can. And you'd rather make that line fluid than even miss once. Touching that stone matters. That matters as much as holding that line matters. And the only real difference is that you are you and she is her.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think I'm going to leave it there. That's really very nice. And Cindy, thank you. You really, you've made me reflective on that too. So I appreciate that. All right, everybody. I'm headed your way tomorrow. Coming in for the bar mitzvah this weekend. It's a big bar mitzvah. We're having a really nice time, and a lot of folks are going to be at Shul. So if you're able to come or able to join in online, join with us.
Have a good Shabbos.
Bye.
Thank you, Rabbi. Good Shabbos.